And welcome to today's webinar on beneficial ownership rules. My name is Anu Sood, and I'm the Director of Marketing at CaseWare RCM and today's moderator. So in today's webinar, we're going to review some of the changes that are happening around beneficial ownership transparency. As many of you know, there are some legislations in the US and Canada, but there's also much happening in Europe and other parts of the world. So to give you an example of some of the changes, here are a few snippets of what's happening globally. In Malta, amendments have been made to the beneficial ownership regulations relating to trusts, foundations, and associations, together with other amendments to the principal AML CFT regulations. These are all related to the recent directive that came into effect in Europe. In the UK, the Department of Finance has refused a request to extend the deadline for the registration of beneficial ownership, following a request by the law firm McCann Fitzgerald. In Indonesia, the country now requires applicants in the energy and mineral resource sectors to disclose all of their shareholders and beneficial owners. And finally, the Cayman Islands has introduced a number of important amendments to its AML regulations, following recommendations made by the regional Caribbean FATF group. So there are a lot of changes that are worth noting, and I hope this presentation gives you a bit more depth into this topic. So a little bit about our presenter. James Cohen is Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. He is an anti-corruption expert with a background in international development and security. As you can see from his biography, he has experience working with many organizations focused on anti-corruption and advising governments and civil society. In fact, currently James is taking part in consultations that are happening here in Canada around a public registry for beneficial ownership and the BC Cullen Commission on Money Laundering. James holds a master's degree from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva and a Bachelor of Social Science in Political Science from the University of Ottawa. So with that, I'd like to pass the presentation over to James.
Thank you, Anu, and thank you everybody for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Caseware for hosting me for this presentation. I hope everyone gets a lot out of it. To start off with, I am the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada, and I'll be getting a bit more into what we do as an organization, but you can look us up at transparencycanada.ca. And to give an overview of what we'll be talking about today, I'll give you a quick run through of who we are, status of beneficial ownership transparency in around the world in a number of places, what's happening, especially in Canada. I know there's a lot of participants from outside of Canada, so I hope this is still very interesting to you. And then what TI Canada is trying to do on beneficial ownership transparency. And indeed, this what we're trying to do around beneficial ownership transparency mirrors what a lot of our partner chapters are doing around the world. So about TI Canada, this is normally the point I should put in a polling question where I ask everybody who's actually knows what Transparency International is, let alone what TI Canada is. And just to let you know, Transparency International started in 1996 by international anti-corruption advocates and some ex-World Bank employees who were tired of the corruption they saw, and they set up Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin. And there's now over 100 country chapters around the world, of which TI Canada is one of them. We were founded in 1996 as well. We've been a largely volunteer-based organization for most of our existence, although we've been building up our staff slowly over the last 3 years, and beneficial ownership transparency is a key project that we're working on, as well as a number of partner chapters around the world. As I mentioned, most chapters in Europe are working on this. A number of chapters in Africa and Latin America and Asia are also working on this issue. In a nutshell, you can find our strategic plan on our website, but in a nutshell, how we work is that Transparency International often prides itself in being a multi-stakeholder platform. So there are nonprofits out there whose goal is to name and shame based on corruption, and we work with a lot of them. And when push comes to shove, Transparency International will do that. But we do try and work with partners from across civil society, business, and government to look at how we can fix gaps in anti-corruption legislation or how that legislation is implemented first before we move to naming and shaming. So one of the things that Transparency International is most known for is the Corruption Perception Index. This came out earlier or at the end of January, the 2019 edition. And most countries know this as the index that comes out once a year and makes some headlines about who's moved up and who's moved down. And I'm sure a number of you on this call probably use the index to conduct risk assessments for your business. I just want to point out something, and an entry point into what we'll be talking about today. When you look at that map, there's this idea that the colors say a lot. And for starters, normally maps that chart how well countries are doing on, say, democracy or human rights, some will be in blue to show they're doing really well, or green that they're doing well, and then of course you run down the red zone. And this map shows that no country is in greens or blues, and that's to say that no country is free from corruption. So while we see a lot of dark reds in Africa or Asia or Latin America, there are still corruption challenges in Western Europe, in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in Japan, other countries. So no country is free from corruption. But what this map also kind of demonstrates, and something TI has been trying to work away from, is this idea that corruption stays within borders. And this won't be news to a lot of you, but the money that is gained through illegal actions or through bribes doesn't always stay in those deep red countries. It often goes to the lighter yellows and orange countries, where we're seen as less corrupt, but we're willing to hide the money of the corrupt. Just in a kind of regional view of the Corruption Perception Index, Western Europe and the EU still amongst the highest ranked regions, and not too many surprises for a number of other regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and North Africa. The Americas, that includes Canada and the US. Canada is the top ranked country at 77, but we've actually fallen for a couple of years. And when I say 77, just to go back to how the index works, countries are ranked of a score out of 100, with 100 being the least corrupt and 1 being the most corrupt. How the index actually works is that a lot of people think that the Corruption Perception Index is Transparency International actually conducting surveys with citizens, but it's not. That's actually the Corruption Barometer, which comes out every 3 years and looks at public perceptions of different institutions in the government. The CPI, for a country to qualify, it's a composite index of 13 other indices. So things like the World Economic Forum review of business, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business, the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Mo Ibrahim Index on Governance for Africa. And any country to be on the CPI needs to have had at least 3 of those indices rank them in the past 3 years. So there's sometimes a lag in a reflection of key corruption issues that have happened in the country. So in the last year, top performers, Denmark and New Zealand still holding their ranks. Some countries that shouldn't be surprising. But when we talk about countries that are at the top of the Corruption Perception Index also being an entryway for illicit funds, we see Switzerland there at number 6, well known for secrecy jurisdiction. And again, we'll get into that more. Countries at the bottom: Venezuela, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, Somalia. For those who want to know, in 2019, Canada dropped 4 points to fall out of the top 10 least corrupt countries. And we moved into the 12th position. This follows a trend for about the last 4 years that Canada's been on a downward slide by a point or 2 per year, and this was the most dramatic slide down. And in the CPI report, this was attributed to what's termed here as snow washing. That's our term for money laundering that we'll get into. And as I know, there's a lot of people from the US on this call. The US dropped from 71 to 69 out of 100. That's a 7-point drop over the last 4 years to now rank 23rd. In the last 8 years, 22 countries significantly improved in the Corruption Perception Index, while 21 significantly decreased, with the rest staying stagnant. So there's still a lot of challenges in anti-corruption enforcement. So that's just a brief introduction to Transparency International. For those of you who didn't know us, happy to answer any questions at the end. And the key piece of research that Transparency International is known for, the Corruption Perception Index. And now we're going to move into the issue of beneficial ownership transparency. And we'll start it off with a poll. And just to ask everybody, in your opinion, what is the most important reason for identifying beneficial ownership information? Regulations compliance, risk mitigation, identify and reduce corruption and financial crime. So we'll just give everyone a few seconds here to cast your vote. Some of you may have even thought that it's all of the above. And so identify and reduce corruption and financial crime. That's good that we see a proactive point of view on this, and people aren't seeing it as a checkbox. Although we do realize that you do have to follow regulations for compliance, and for a number of you, especially in the legal field, it's getting very specific answers from the government as to what you need to do on compliance, and we'll get to that in a bit. So status of beneficial ownership transparency around the world. First of all, why are we so concerned with this? So a bit of shell company and anonymous ownership 101 that a number of you again will know. But for those maybe coming new into this who are only dealing with anonymous companies or shell companies more recently, when we say shell companies or when we say anonymous companies or when we say those disguising the ultimate beneficial owner, it's really done through a process, a number of mechanisms that people are exploiting the regulatory loopholes in a number of companies to hide who they are at the end of the day. Now, importantly, I'll say that not everyone who has a numbered company or an anonymous company is a criminal, of course. There are people who open up numbered companies for a number of legitimate reasons. But this is a tool that's highly exploited around the world by tax evaders, mafia, uh, drug cartels, kleptocrats stealing from some of the poorest countries around the world, to terrorist organizations. Essentially, using intermediaries to open company number 123 that will then open up company number ABC that will then open up company number QL squiggly sign, if you're allowed to do that in a certain country, and to distance oneself from the ultimate purchase of, say, a piece of property to store your cash or any other tangible asset. You might open up a number of companies in a number of different secrecy jurisdictions, making it harder and harder for law enforcement that might be examining the suspicious ownership of a condo in, say, Vancouver or central London or New York City. It'll be harder and harder for them to follow the paper trail of who owns that company. And of course, you can mask this even further by appointing nominees to sign for ownership of your company or sign nominees for directors. So there's a range of tools that those who want to hide their identity for illicit purposes can do so. And for the average citizen, and I'm sure not for a lot of you on this call, but for the average citizen, this can start to become a nebulous topic as to, well, what does it really matter to me? But anonymous ownership of companies and the storing of assets to hide kickbacks and illegal deals really do affect citizens on a day-to-day business, from helping facilitate the perpetuation of the fentanyl crisis in Canada and the US to some of the worst human rights violators in the world taking kickbacks for their actions, to, as we see, illegal logging and environmental degradation around the world. This is the gateway tool for a lot of criminal activity that perpetuates some of our worst social ills around the world. So this is why this is an extremely important topic. It's not just a random topic, for technical purpose sake. So to start us off on where countries are on trying to eliminate or reveal transparency around these anonymous companies, let's start off with what the US is doing. And there's been a vigorous campaign in the US to try and get beneficial ownership transparency from a number of our partner organizations, such as Tax Justice Network, and not even NGOs, but also there's been statements by previous lieutenant governors of the state of Delaware, known as one of the worst secrecy jurisdictions in the US, saying there needs to be greater transparency around beneficial ownership. And there's really been a security perspective in the US as to why to end secrecy around, or why to end anonymous companies in the US. A lot of push by the State Department, by the Defense Department around terrorist organizations potentially using anonymous ownership of companies. And indeed, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was using a shell company in Trump Towers, well before Mr. Trump was president, to funnel illicit finances while they were under sanctions. So what's happened so far in the US is there is legislation in the works to create a national registry that would bypass states, that would collect beneficial ownership information. This would be a private registry, not accessible to the public, but only to oversight authorities and law enforcement. So in 2019, there was the Corporate Transparency Act that was passed through the House of Representatives in the US in October. And now there's the Illicit Cash Act in the Senate that's gone through a first review. Now, it's important to note that these are bipartisan pieces of legislation having support from both Democrats and Republicans in the US. And you'll note there on the third bullet point, there is White House endorsement of this. In his last testimony last year to the House of Representatives, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin actually put forward to Congress that he wanted to see legislation for him to sign off on, put forward by the House on beneficial ownership transparency. So there is a large range of endorsement for beneficial ownership transparency in the US, which is really welcome. There's a perception that this might be regulatory burden for small businesses, and we'll get into that argument a little later on. So from an advocacy organization, we're really pleased to see the momentum going forward. We'd like to see a publicly accessible registry, but there's still momentum, which we're happy about. An interesting tool that's been used in the US since 2016 is geographic targeting orders. And this started out in the Treasury Department doing a bit of an experiment, really, to see who owned or who had anonymous ownership in some of the wealthiest jurisdictions in the US. And so with this order, the Treasury Department, or FinCEN within the Treasury Department, first looked at Manhattan and Miami-Dade counties, and they had a cap of $1 million for cash purchases. And they found an alarming percentage of high value properties were red flags for anonymous ownership in cash transactions. And they extended those geographic targeting orders to require purchasers to identify who the true ultimate beneficial owner was of these properties. And interestingly, a review by researchers at the University of Miami and by, I believe it's the Justice Department in the state of New York, could be corrected if anybody wants to chime in on that in the comments. They found that there was a 95% drop in cash purchases in Miami. Now, they're in anonymous ownership in Miami purchases. Now, they hadn't seen a drop in cash purchases, which makes them suspect that there might be, or people who are still looking to hide their cash might be looking for a way to hide their money. But they did not see a fall off in real estate sales in Miami, and they saw the skyrocketing rates of property ownership or property prices steady out to a more reasonable level. So they did see some effects from the geographic targeting orders. In 2019, GTOs were extended to 9 counties in a number of different states. So off the top of my head, I believe that's Boston, New York, Miami-Dade, San Antonio in Texas, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Seattle. I might be forgetting one or two, but there's starting to be a favorite tool of the Treasury Department. But of course, as criminals find out where one area is being targeted, it's the balloon effect, and you'll start to see other areas being targeted. So before Boston was targeted, there were headlines in the Boston Globe about anonymous ownership of property surging within Boston. And also where the limit in 2016 was $1 million in purchases, it's been lowered to $300,000 in purchases. So quite a bit of movement in the US and new tools being used, and definitely something to watch as the Illicit Cash Act gets reviewed in the US Senate. The EU has had a lot of movement in the last couple of years, and a lot of this spurs from, and indeed a lot of the action on beneficial ownership transparency first surges from the financial crisis in 2008. And then when Europe was hit by the financial crisis, a lot of leaders in Europe saw that beneficial ownership transparency or lack thereof and anonymous companies were key tools in tax avoidance within the EU. And there was an effort to start cracking down on that. And then, of course, as the Panama Papers broke in 2016, and it became revealed the extent of anonymous companies being used for global illicit finances, there was this second push. So I've got to say, as somebody who's worked in international development and advocacy over a number of years, you tend to see emergencies dip and rise in the headlines, and sometimes short memories. We look at one crisis and think, well, 5 years ago, didn't we see a problem? But corruption and illicit financial flows has been something that's been in the global headlines for a number of years and isn't really going anywhere. So this is pushing a lot of this momentum. So what did the European Union do? Well, Anti-Money Laundering Directive 4 in 2014 was its first push on collection of beneficial ownership information, the creation of national beneficial ownership registries. It obliged entities to report inconsistencies and needed implementation by 2017. So at that time, it was still up to countries to figure out how to create these registries and how public they wanted them. But then there was the push in 2018 for AMLD5, and this required all EU countries to set up public disclosure of beneficial ownership information on companies, but not trusts. And the implementation date for this was January 2020. So how are European Union countries doing on implementation of their public registries? Well, it's a bit of mix and go. I've been getting feedback from a lot of my colleagues in Europe as to how it's going. Some countries do have public registries, but there are still paywalls in terms of the idea of public wasn't defined by the European Union. Some countries missed the mark entirely and are still updating their legislation, such as Italy is still putting in their legislation. Some countries have a public registry, but its functionality and oversight isn't that great. So Slovenia is one of those countries, Lithuania is another one of those countries. And so it's still very much a mixed bag in Europe to comply with AMLD5 going forward. Now, the country that really started the push for beneficial ownership transparency and public access to this was the UK. And they've set the benchmark, or as my colleagues at Transparency International UK have told me, don't look at us as the golden example of what to do on a public registry. Look at us as the guinea pig. And we'll get into this, but at least it sets the standard. So they first established their public beneficial ownership registry in an open data format in 2016. A big problem with this is that there's no independent verification system. And so a problem with that is that there's no drop-down menus for different fields such as country of residency. So people have been entering into fields things like citizenship, United Kingdom, U.K, British, U.K. Cornish. So there's been a number of fields that don't have verification. There are people who own companies who are over 100 and people who are 1 year old or even not born yet. So bravo them on their entrepreneurial skills. And so this first review of these verification problems with the registry in the UK was brought to light by the nonprofit organization uh, Global Witness, who did a first review of the registry and found these challenges. And the registry is housed within Companies House, and they're doing a review currently as well on how they can better implement the system. But they've managed to come through with a couple of decent findings, and that's generally from a business perspective that most businesses have found the public access of data to be useful, and the majority don't find it to be a hindrance. And we'll get into that a little later on the business benefits of a public registry. Now, a couple other things that have happened in the UK is that they do have a draft real estate law to disclose the ultimate beneficial owner on real estate purchases. There's another tool called unexplained wealth orders that has some controversy, as it's being reviewed here in Canada by the BC government. But what that does is that it actually allows the government to put the onus on a citizen to explain their purchases and their wealth. So the first example comes from the wife of I believe it's Azerbaijani central banker, who went on a multi-million-pound shopping spree in Harrods, and her husband's annual pay, I think, is about $100,000. And so the UK government has seized her assets and asked her to explain this. Now, this has come up as a potential tool that the BC government is looking at, but it's being discussed publicly as the BC Civil Liberties Society is questioning if this is constitutional, but still an interesting tool to think about. And of course, the UK is known also for its crown dependencies overseas, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and a lot of people have said it's fine that the UK has this public registry, and even maybe that EU countries and Canada and the US are looking at public registries, but until these tropical islands, tax havens are open, nothing's going to happen. Well, the House of Lords did pass a law that the crown dependencies must follow suit with the UK registry. Indeed, the overseas dependencies are following suit. So as Anu said at the beginning, the Cayman Islands is putting legislation forwards to have a public registry, as are a number of other overseas dependencies. So this is a large amount of momentum. And as people say often, fine, criminals will just find somewhere else to put their dirty money. The appealing thing for criminals is to find a stable market where they don't believe that the government's going to seize their assets arbitrarily. They want to get their money out of those countries. And more as these stable markets wind up having transparency, the areas become limited for criminals to go to that they know that their illicit finances will be safe for them. And so it's very important that this is a collective action movement across the world to create transparency of beneficial ownership. Some other jurisdictions to talk about, there are countries outside of the AMLD5 legislation and the UK, Canada, and the US. And a really interesting case study to note is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI. And for those of you who are not familiar with the EITI, this is a global initiative to create transparency around oil, gas mining, and general extractive, specifically in those extractive sectors, to create transparency about around the revenue from those sectors for a number of countries. Canada is not a signatory to the EITI, but we do support it through Foreign Affairs Canada. An initiative that the EITI put forward is by 2020, all implementing countries have to ensure that all extractive companies that apply for or hold a participating interest in an exploration or production extractive license or contract in their countries publish the names of their real owners. Also, any politically exposed persons holding ownership in oil, gas, and mining projects must be publicly identified. So it's not a publicly accessible registry, it's of all companies, it's a sector-specific registry that the EITI is calling for. And what I don't have here in a bullet is that they are, in fact, calling for those registries to be publicly published. And a number of these countries are saying, well, let's just go completely forward and create full company registries of ultimate beneficial ownership of countries. So countries that are looking to have public registries online within the year are Nigeria and Ghana. I've spoken with their chapters, and they're looking to push this ahead. Some other countries that are working towards this and working on legislation, Liberia, Kenya, I know Chile, they're working with the government on this. And so this is an initiative that's being pushed forward. Another global initiative that's trying to push forward public registries is the Open Government Partnership, of which I believe it's now 100 countries are part of the Open Government Partnership that looks for ways to make government data more transparent to their citizens. Canada is a signatory to the OGP. It was set up by former President Barack Obama. The US is a signatory to the OGP. And at the last summit in 2019 in Canada, there was a greater push for beneficial ownership transparency registries and public accessibility. So within Canada's pledge on the OGP reforms, there is a pledge on greater transparency, but not a full pledge on a registry. So there is a lot of momentum around the world towards transparent or publicly accessible beneficial ownership transparency. Where there's not been a pledge towards this so far is the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. But regardless, it's the trend of where a lot of the world is going. So another poll question for everybody. What are the top 3 challenges or concerns with complying with beneficial ownership regulations? Knowing and implementing policies, procedures to comply, accessing beneficial ownership information, client resistance, verifying and storing beneficial ownership information, or keeping up to date with any beneficial ownership changes. And so this is, I'd say a number of these are the reason to have a public registry, and we'll get to that point in a moment, but it'd be interesting to hear everybody's viewpoints of what their challenges are. Okay, client resistance, very interesting to see as a top result. Keeping up to date with beneficial ownership changes. Accessing beneficial ownership information comes pretty close to client resistance. So there's this idea that a number of you are truly trying to get this information, but have a very difficult time even getting access to it, and the very people you're dealing with might be a challenge to you to get that information. Knowing the rules and changes, as maybe there's a lot of regulation that's changing, and verifying and storing beneficial ownership information. I've definitely heard about verifying information is a large challenge for a number of people. We'll bring that up a little later. Okay, so finally, where is Canada in all this? And before we get into the details, or we'll actually go through the first 2 slides, and then we'll get into the story of snow washing for Canada. So Canada has been slammed in the last couple of years by a number of organizations on our anti-money laundering regulations, or gaps in our anti-money laundering regulations, and specifically our beneficial ownership information. In a mutual evaluation in 2016, we were slammed by the FATF on beneficial ownership information and our lack of collection of company information and on trusts, and that there were too many entities that do not need to collect information, designated non-financial businesses and persons lists that don't need to collect this information. And then lawyers were also cited as a key issue in beneficial ownership information, or collecting beneficial ownership information. Now with lawyers, what's interesting is that there was a 2015 Supreme Court ruling that due to attorney-client privileges, lawyers do not have to report beneficial ownership information to our financial regulator, FinTech that's housed within Finance Canada. That decision is still not, it's not under review, but Finance Canada is talking with legal societies across Canada about how to work around this issue that's can be done in a constitutionally compliant way. Law societies have updated a number of their self-reporting rules, cutting back the amount of cash that lawyers can take on hand, and expanding a number of self-reporting requirements. But there still seem to be challenges. And if any of you know what's going on in British Columbia, the Cohen Commission looking into money laundering there, I testified yesterday, as have a number of legal groups in British Columbia. And there is pushback by law societies about this idea of labeling lawyers as a black hole. I know there, of course, there are a lot of lawyers doing their jobs and trying to make sure that dirty money doesn't enter, but there's still this challenge of intermediaries writ large, lawyers, accountants, real estate brokers that facilitate dirty money, and it's still being looked at of how to do the best job possible to close this gap. Another organization that's reviewing globally across the world on beneficial ownership transparency is Transparency International ourselves. We review the G20 commitments, the G20 high-level commitments on beneficial ownership that were set in 2014 in Australia. Now, we did our first review on this in 2015, and as expected, a lot of countries were caught off guard and had limited to weak beneficial ownership frameworks. But by 2017, a number of countries had picked up their beneficial ownership framework and improved, but Canada was still deemed to be in a weak framework, held back with just South Korea. And it was pointed out to me, I didn't even realize yesterday, that the US is not on that 2017 graph. It is in the publication Leaders and Laggards from 2017, and Canada is, or the United States, sorry, is under the average framework. So there was some movement by the United States within that time. So Canada has a lot of work to do, judged by international peers and by international oversight bodies. And where we've really been hit is that within the Panama Papers in 2016, as reporters around the world were digging through these numbers, reporters from the Toronto Star and the CBC unearthed the correspondences by Mossack Fonseca relating to Canada. And they found that Mossack Fonseca was kind of target or selling Canada to his clients on the idea that A, we have weak beneficial ownership framework within Canada and a weak anti-money laundering framework within Canada, but also who suspects Canada? Basically, you think of places like Switzerland or the Cayman Islands, or for those in the know, places like Delaware or the city of London or New York or Netherlands to be places to funnel money, but no one really thinks about Canada. And so it's the idea of bring your dirty money to Canada and it will be cleaned like the pure white snow. And hence we have the term snow washing in Canada to describe our money laundering problems. In British Columbia, the situation has burst at the seams, where they've also identified a term called the Vancouver model of money laundering. And without getting too far into detail, this is a very specific model of money being filtered from China through gambling circuits and underground banks there, connected to underground banks and casinos in the lower mainland in British Columbia. That filters into real estate purchases there and back into domestic crime. And this is why there's now the Cullen Commission in British Columbia after a number of government issued reports and the people of British Columbia demanding accountability as to how BC got into this situation. So happy to answer any questions about the Vancouver model or snow washing further. But in terms of regulatory framework, Canada's anti-money laundering regulation is set out through the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. And this requires financial institutions, this oversees financial institutions, security dealers, life insurers, and money service businesses must record beneficial ownership information and take reasonable measures to confirm its accuracy. Now, the PCML TFA was updated or has been going through a couple of updates recently, so I'll go through those. There's a 25% threshold for beneficial ownership or control for the sake of reporting. There must be an official documentation obtained or an attestation, or there must be reasonable measures, including taking clients' word for it in writing, that the information they are submitting is true. If unable to identify or confirm beneficial owners, obliged entities must identify most senior managing officer or treat clients as high risk. There is no beneficial ownership reporting obligation for DNFBPs, but that is a recommendation that that has been put forward by Finance Canada and might be put into legislation by the spring, that DNFBPs do need to report on beneficial ownership information. Further on taking reasonable measures, it used to be you had a 30-day reporting requirement, but now it's within a reasonable time, which I've heard lawyers say is even worse, that it creates ambiguity around the reporting requirements for them and their clients. So there have been some developments within Canada moving forward on beneficial ownership transparency. And this starts off with the meeting of finance ministers across our various jurisdictions. And why is this important in Canada? Well, the viewpoint on bringing about beneficial ownership transparency is the entrance to this is through our corporate registries. And there are corporate registries for the federal government, for all provinces, and for the territories. So the largest corporate registries in Canada are first Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, then the federal government. So even if the federal government went on its own and created a beneficial ownership registry, it would still be a minor dent in corporate transparency throughout Canada. We have to get all of the provinces on board. And there is legislative ways that the federal government could push for the provinces to have registries or collect their data, but this might face constitutional challenges, or probably would face constitutional challenges from the other jurisdictions. So there has to be discussions amongst the finance ministers from all the jurisdictions. Now, an agreement was first set for the first phase of beneficial ownership transparency within Canada, and this was done through the Canadian Business and Corporations Act that all other jurisdictions would then mirror in their own provincial or territorial acts. And what this asks for is that all businesses must have must maintain a record of true ultimate beneficial owners for their company. They must have this information on hand. Law enforcement can request this information from them, but it's they have to give up this information within 30 days. So essentially, this would be like knocking on the door of a criminal hideout and saying, could all of you please identify yourself, but I'll sit out here and wait. And so we viewed this amendment more as getting companies ready to have their ultimate beneficial ownership information ready for the next phase, but not as a truly useful tool for fighting money laundering. Now we're into what's being called the second phase of work throughout the country on ultimate beneficial ownership. And these are consultations on what to do next in terms of collecting that information. And the federal government started its public consultation in February, just about 3 weeks ago, to our surprise, on should Canada adopt a public registry of ultimate beneficial ownership. Anybody can make a submission to this by going to Finance Canada. The consultation papers are on their website, and the consultation goes until March 26th. So we're pleased to see that the consultation has happened. We've been in discussions with the federal government for a couple of years now about this, when they first weren't thinking about even a registry, and then thinking about it, but making it limited to the point where they said, even civil society would be open for the consultations, and now it is a fully public consultation. This comes on the heel of the province of Quebec holding a public consultation in December on reviews about reforms to their tax compliance. And the province of British Columbia is also currently holding a public consultation. And this goes until, I believe, March 13th. So there is momentum in Canada now on the idea of looking at registries across jurisdictions. There's word that Manitoba might be next in line. That's purely speculation, just because they were one of the provinces to amend their Corporate Businesses Act in time with complying with timelines that were set out between the federal government and provinces and territories. A number of other provinces are behind on complying even with mirroring the CBCA amendments. Now, British Columbia is very interesting because they're moving forward in a number of ways, all spurred by what I talked about, the Vancouver model. And so, on top of the Cohen Commission that came out of a number of government-issued reports, one conducted by Dr. Peter German, former RCMP officer. He wrote 2 reports called Dirty Money, first looking at casinos, as that was the first area to be recognized as a gap for money for anti-money laundering in BC. He then wrote a second report that looked more expansively at real estate, at the luxury car market, and other areas. There was also, and those 2 reports were commissioned by the Attorney General of British Columbia. There was the second report issued by the Finance Department of British Columbia looking at real estate, and those have spurred the Cullen Commission. There's also the Land Ownership Transparency Act that was passed in British Columbia, and this would require the reporting of ultimate beneficial ownership information on real estate within British Columbia. That's LOTA. It's been passed but has not been implemented yet. So while the legislation came out of the proposed legislation in the UK, it's the first legislation to be passed in the world. As I said, the PCM-LTFA went under review, and we're seeing a number of amendments going through now. And I'm going to speed up a little bit as I'm seeing the time. So why are we so concerned about beneficial ownership transparency at Transparency International Canada, and what are we trying to do about it? And I'll go through these quickly. You can look at our 2 reports, but we've flagged issues within Canada on beneficial ownership transparency. Our first report was in 2016, looking at Canada's beneficial ownership framework overall. And our first original piece of research looked at the 100 wealthiest pieces of property in the greater Vancouver area. And we identified that almost 50% of those properties, no one knows who the true owner is. They were either purchased by shell companies or by nominees or by trusts. The RCMP, little did we know, was also doing their own investigation of real estate in Vancouver at the time, and has pegged the number at $1.6 billion going through Vancouver real estate in the last few years, I believe that was their time frame. We did a follow-up report in 2019 that looked at the Greater Toronto Area, and we looked at 1.4 million real estate transactions in the GTA from 2008 to 2018. And this was a risk assessment. We didn't look specifically at where dirty money might be, but we did find disturbing numbers that over $20 billion in those real estates had little to no oversight in their transactions, either because they were purchased through companies that were typically difficult to figure out who the ultimate beneficial owner was, or they were done through non-mortgage purchases that do not report ultimate beneficial ownership. And so we've put that out. That's opacity, why criminals love Canadian real estate. So we've put out our warnings as to what the problems are in Canadian real estate. And what is it we're asking for? Well, of course, it's a publicly accessible registry of beneficial ownership within Canada. We'd want to see a centralized registry that all jurisdictions feed their information up into. We'd also like to see beneficial ownership disclosure in real estate transactions. We want to see verification of that information. We'd like to see trustees have to report on who, or nominees report on who they're acting as a nominee for, and we would like to see trustee or trust transparency as well. We realize that trust is an additional complicated issue that we'd have to tackle as a separate issue. And any registry would need strong enforcement and sanctions within it. It might be one thing to have a registry open, but we want to see law enforcement have the capability, indeed the registry have the mandate to review the data that's coming into it. And we want to see strong sanctions that criminals don't see as just the cost of doing business. Why a public registry? There's a couple of reasons why we want to see it be accessible to those just beyond oversight entities or law enforcement, but be open to everyone, including investigative journalists and other businesses who are not necessarily reporting entities. One is that we believe it's a deterrent effect, and an example of this is Scottish limited partnerships within the UK that up to 2015, as the graph shows, were not required to disclose ultimate beneficial ownership, and they were being used by a number of entities coming from known secrecy jurisdictions such as Cyprus or Malta. And the second they became public, there was an 80% drop off in registry of Scottish limited partnerships. So we do think that they'd be a deterrent effect for those who would want to still try to exploit our system. It's an extra set of eyes on the registry. As much as we'd like to say law enforcement will do its job, we do know that they have limited resources across the country, and this creates greater scrutiny and greater ability for those to investigate who might be trying to hide their money. And already our partners at Transparency International UK and Global Witness have been going through the UK registry to identify arms dealers who have been trying to use it. We believe also that if Canada is open for global finance, we should be open for global scrutiny. If a kleptocrat wants to steal their funds from their impoverished country and bring it to Canada as a safe haven, we believe the citizens of that country should also be able to follow that kleptocrat's funds and let Canadian law enforcement know that, hey, we know our local mayor only makes $500 a month, but owns mansions in Richmond Hill or in West Vancouver or in Mount Royal in Montreal. Independent monitoring of how well the registry is working. As I explained earlier, Global Witness did the first review of the UK registry. As I mentioned before, it's a global standard of where the world is moving to. Indeed, we believe that it's good for business. And how is that so? One, it increases due diligence for small, medium-sized enterprises who don't have the same financial means as large businesses to conduct due diligence on their business partners. It's important for companies, especially in complex financial worlds, for everyone to have access to know who they're doing business with, and for small, medium-sized enterprises to not be victims of fraud. This will decrease forms to financial institutions for those same small, medium-sized enterprises on what they need to fill out. If they want to go for a loan for CIBC, that's one batch of forms that they need to fill out versus going then to BMO or TD. For those of you not in Canada, these are our Canadian banks. These are new forms. Instead, those financial institutions are able to access the registry and be able to conduct due diligence. And finally, this is cost saving for our financial institutions. I've spoken to many representatives of financial institutions, both our big banks and up and coming financial institutions, small and nimble ones who want to enter the market. And this would drastically cut down on their costs for conducting due diligence and complying with government regulations. On components of a registry, when we first started talking about this, there was a lot of pushback initially, people saying, oh, you want our social insurance number or you want all our bank information. It's nothing like that. We want a very limited amount of information. We believe that a registry should issue unique identifiers for all users. The full legal name should be accessible for the public. There should be a partial date of birth, both the month and year of birth, that is accessible, but the day of birth should not be accessible except for law enforcement. The service or correspondence address should be publicly accessible. home address would be accessible only for law enforcement. The country of tax residence should be accessible. Nature and extent of ownership held. We think that it should be dropped to 10% from 25%. Citizenship would be known to law enforcement, not to the public. And then politically exposed persons or heads of international organizations should be known as well. This is the information that we're asking for. We've done a review on if these fields are constitutionally compliant, and for the most part, these have a low expectation of privacy, these fields that we're asking for. And we're going to be making that report and that analysis available online soon. So in a final poll, I see we're almost out of time. After that discussion, we'd like to know, what kind of beneficial ownership registry would you like to see implemented? A public registry, a private registry, or none? And we'll just give everyone a few seconds here. There's only 3 options. I'll grab a drink of water. Well, that's very good to know that the majority of you want to see a public registry. And for those of you in Canada, the consultations are going on right now, so please do make your voices known to the federal government and the BC government. And in the US, let your legislators know as well. TI Canada, we're doing this as part of our End Snow Washing campaign. We work with 2 other organizations, Publish What You Pay Canada and Canadians for Tax Fairness. And for those of you on the line who are Canadian or even elsewhere, if you want to support us in our work, you can go to our website, transparencycanada.ca. You can become a member of TI Canada. You can become a corporate supporter of ours if your corporation would like to be a supporter and be recognized as such. Or you can make a direct donation and get your tax receipt right away. And we'd be thankful for anybody who wants to do any one or all 3 of these.
So Alessa is an integrated AML compliance solution that offers customer due diligence, sanction screening, transaction monitoring, and regulatory reporting. Our solution is not only used by banks, but also MSBs, FinTechs, and gaming. We offer a host of benefits, including the ability to integrate your data from various AML systems, so you get a holistic view of your risks. So if you'd like to get more information about our product, drop us a note or visit our website at alessa.caseware.com. So with that, I'd like to thank James for leading today's webinar and providing this update. Clearly, there's a lot happening, lots of great information. So I do encourage you to donate to TI Canada, because they're doing a lot of great work on the behalf of Canadians and globally as well. And this now concludes our presentation. Thank you very much and have a great day.